Good afternoon and welcome to CEC Gurukul lecture. In continuation with the series on sociological research method, in today's lecture we are going to discuss on the relationship between theory and research. And to understand this, we are going to refer to R.K. Merton's book Social Theory and Structure. Now, before we try to understand Merton's argument on how we need to kind of build a sociological theory which is connected to the empirical reality, it's very important to understand that why theory, because whenever we go to a field to do any kind of research, we should be aware of the existing literature, the existing theoretical instances on it, and therefore we were going to either kind of build on the existing story or construct a new theory. Now, this reading by R.K. Merton is one of the key readings in most of the undergraduate and postgraduate syllabus to understand the linkage between theory and research. This lecture is basically based on chapter 4 of the book, and we are going to understand Merton's argument on the nature of sociological theory. So, Robert Merton was a prominent American sociologist and is widely considered one of the most influential sociologists of 20th century. Now, why is he considered as influential sociologist? Because he kind of brought about a break in terms of giving a new direction to sociological research and theory, and gave us a number of new concepts like latent and manifest functions, mid-range theory, and so on. So, when we look into this idea of the linkage between theory and research, Merton argued that sociological theory and empirical research have often been separated, leading to two unproductive extremes. On one side, we have abstract grand theory that cannot be tested and isolated empirical studies that have no theoretical significance. So, the two sides that Merton is referring to, or the two extreme, is one side we have the grand theory that is kind of making a generalization on certain social reality, and these realities are assumed to be uniformly found in society. And on the other extreme are isolated empirical studies. So, basically these are case-based studies or micro-level studies, and they are only dealing with that particular empirical reality. Now, in between the two, there is no connection, there is no kind of relation, and that is the reason why Merton then advocates for middle-range theory. Now, middle-range theories are specific enough to be tested by empirical research, but broad enough to be applied to different situations. So, it is in between the grand theory and the isolated empirical reality, and that is kind of taking into account the theoretical instances as well as the specific empirical reality. Now, these two extreme approaches or the contrasting approaches has kind of affected the way in sociological theories have been built, and that is why he is referring to the first extreme as the grand theorist, and these sociologists focused on generalization and formulating sociological laws, valuing the scope of their work over the ability to prove their theories. Now, one of the way in which we try to understand the sociologists who belong to the grand theories are basically the founding fathers who were trying to develop a science of the society, and therefore were trying to build a scientific way of understanding society. So, just as you have laws in the natural physical sciences, so there were sociological laws being built. Now, these laws were kind of grand assumptions to be fitted into all society, but then what actually happens is to day everyday social reality is not fixed. There are a lot of changes, there are a lot of differences, there are a lot of cultural specificity. So, how do we capture those? So, the grand theorists were missing on these. They focused on creating broad global summaries and sociological laws. They avoid small scale observation in favor of broad global summaries. So, we have on one side these grand theorists, on the other side we have the radical empiricist. These sociologists prioritize the scope and significance of their theories over their empirical variability. Their motto could be, we do not know whether what we say is true, but it is at least significant. So, it can't be proved as wrong or right or kind of a global phenomena. So, in terms of the specific micro level research, the data is as evidence, it is can be considered that what the data is suggesting is true, but there is no attempt to generalize, there is no attempt to make universal laws. So, this second group in contrast prioritizes variable facts and detailed, small scale observation, remaining confident in what they report as true, even if they do not extensively explore the implication of the research. The radical empiricist motto is, this is demonstrably so, but we cannot indicate its significance. Now, these two camps, that is the grand theorist versus the radical empiricist, there is no logical reason for these two camps to be in opposition. Merton suggests that a more effective approach would be to combine both the methods. Generalization should be grounded in disciplined observation, and detailed observation should be connected to their theoretical implications. So, it is not that they are pole apart, they are kind of opposed to each other. So, whatever theories are existing or they is relevant at a larger or a macro level needs to be applied through research at the micro. So, there is a two-way flow between the theoretical foundation and the empirical reality. So, Merton believed this idea, while seemingly obvious, deserves further explanation to understand its full implication for sociological theory and empirical research. Now, in order to do research in social science, in sociology specifically, he kind of cautioned sociologists to maintain distance from the mature science. Because sociology was emerging, it kind of emerges very late and it has kind of not attained that maturity. So, Merton argues in discussion of sociological theory and scientific method, we should avoid using example from mature sciences like physics and biology. The reason is that these fields are so advanced that they can work with highly abstract concepts in a way that sociology, which is not yet as mature, cannot. He believed that many discussions of scientific method are too abstract to be practically applied to current sociological research. Now, therefore, for the sociologist, which was a kind of nurturing and emerging as a discipline, it is important to build its own theory independent of the physical sciences. And he kind of puts forward the immediate goal is to make these scientific requirements more directly applicable to the analytical work that is feasible in sociology. Merton also points out that the term sociological theory is often used too broadly. It encompasses several different activities, and these activities have distinct functions and impacts on empirical social research. To have a more productive discussion, these different types of theory should be distinguished and analyzed individually. So, as students of say the beginners of sociology, we are kind of made accustomed to idea that there is a functional theory, there is a conflict theory. So, there are different ways of which the theory has been constructed in relation to the kind of reality that it has explained or the objective of the research. Therefore, it is very important to kind of understand this variance in sociological theories. And here he says that there are 6 types of work often grouped under the umbrella of sociological theory. So, you need to be conceptually clear in terms of what theory means. Most of the time in sociological writings, there is a kind of coming together of 6 types of work. One is methodology, second is general sociological orientation, third, analysis of sociological concepts. So, when we look into these different types, we need to differentiate between sociological theory and methodology. Merton argues that methodology is the logic and procedure of scientific inquiry, whereas sociological theory is about the substantive content of how people interact. So, methodology is basically how the technique or the way in which we study the society, and theory is basically the content, how people interact, the social behavior. So, they are it's distinct, it's not kind of need to be confused. Sociological theory is substantive, focusing on the actual content of social interaction. In contrast, methodology is about the logic of scientific procedure and transcends any single discipline. So, methodology is present in the other disciplines like psychology, history, political science, but when we say sociological theory, it is kind of very distinct to the discipline of sociology. Now, knowing how to test a hypothesis, which is methodology, is different from knowing the theory from which to derive the hypothesis. Now, current sociological training may focus too much on the former. There is kind of more focus to test hypothesis rather than kind of understanding from where has this hypothesis been built. Now, sociologists, like many in a fledgling discipline, have a tendency to obsess over methodology. He refers to this as hierophants of methodology, suggesting that this focus may divert energy from building substantive theory. This methodology is seen as a sign of an immature science, similar to an apprentice who self-consciously analyze every skill, unlike a master who performs them habitually. The common practice of using physics and chemistry as methodological models for sociology, these sciences have centuries of accumulated research that sociology lacks. Such comparison and pragmatic and unrealistic, creating a gap between methodological aspiration and the current reality of sociological research, thus suggesting a more realistic and less invidious approach to methodological demand. The second, he talks about general sociological orientation. So, he differentiates between theory and methodology and causes us to not kind of do comparison with more mature science like physics and chemistry, rather kind of do its own empirical research and build its own theory. In the general sociological orientation, he argues that much of what is labeled as sociological theory in textbook is generally a collection of general sociological orientation. So, we need to differentiate theory from methodology. Second, he argues that it is important to differentiate theory from sociological orientation. These are broad perspectives that guide an investigator by suggesting which type of variable or factors are important to consider, rather than providing specific testable hypotheses about how those variables relate to each other. These sociological orientation, while not offering specific hypotheses, provides a crucial framework for research. These are guiding principles, not direct predictions. They serve as the starting point for developing more specific hypotheses. Merton uses example of Malinowski, who used a general orientation that social structure shapes sentiments to investigate the Oedipus complex in different cultural contexts. While the orientation suggested the relevance of social structure, it did not specify the exact variable to study. Malinowski still had to find those himself. Merton further observed that sociology influences on other discipline comes more from this broad orientation than from specific confirmed hypotheses. These general viewpoints act as foundational matrix from which new hypotheses can be generated. In short, general sociological orientations are essential for directing inquiry and providing context, but they are not the same as specific testable theories. Sociology's influence on other discipline comes from its general orientation rather than from providing specific confirmed theories. Now, the third, he is saying, is the distinction between sociological theory and the analysis of sociological concept. Merton argues that while conceptual analysis is crucial part of theory, an array of concepts alone does not constitute a theory. Concepts define what is to be observed and are the variables for which empirical relationships are sought. Theory emerges when these concepts are logically interrelated into a system or scheme. Merton suggests that some sociologists have an anti-theoretical bias because they mistake the part, that is, they confuse between theory and conceptual analysis. So, that distinction needs to be, every theory will have a set of concepts. Now, the concept per se is not theory, these concepts are necessary to build a theory. So, he differentiates between concepts and theory. What are theory? According to Merton, concepts are the building blocks. Concepts like status, role, anomie are the definition of variable that sociologists use to observe and analyze social phenomena. They are the essential component of a theoretical system. Theories link concepts. A theory only begins to emerge when these concepts are logically interrelated within a structured scheme. Some of the anti-theoretic bias among sociologists stems from a misunderstanding where conceptual clarification is mistaken for the entirety of theoretical analysis. The whole is greater than the sum of its part. So, what is the whole? The whole is the theory. And what are the parts? The parts are the concepts. Now, the concepts for a particular theory are all related to that specific research or specific social structure, and they are connected to each other. So, in short, what is the distinction between concepts and theory? Concepts define what to observe, so a society is full of multiple variables, multiple realities. Now, you need to be, as a researcher, be clear that what are you studying, what are your variables for research. So, these variables are basically giving you the guideline to focus your research on that reality. So, these are the concepts. Now, theory on the other hand explains how these defined variables are connected to one another through a system of propositions. Therefore, conceptual clarification is vital, but often overlooked, part of sociological theory that directly influences empirical research. Merton emphasized that the concepts chosen to guide data collections are crucial. If the concepts are selected poorly so that no relationship exists between the variable, the research will be unproductive regardless of how well it is conducted. And that is why whenever we kind of do a research, it is very important at the initial to identify the core concepts, and you need a conceptual clarity on this, because if there is no clarity on the concepts, that is basically the variables that you will study, the finding of the research will be not fruitful. So, conceptual clarification is one of the important functions in terms of doing research, and what is this conceptual clarification? It is to define the character of data included in a concept. Merton uses Edwin Sutherland's work on crime as a key example. Sutherland re-examined the common narrow definition of crime, which was primarily based on official statistics that disproportionately recorded low-class offences. By clarifying the concept to include white-collar criminality, violations of criminal law by people in business and professions, Sutherland showed that the initial assumption about the high association between low social status and a crime might be false. So, if the concept itself was based on an assumption that crime is associated with low class, then the finding was biased, and therefore the concept of white collar criminality changed the findings of the research. Now, this conceptual re-evaluation led to liquidation of previous hypotheses that linked crime to factors like poverty and slum condition. So, if your finding is that the crime is a low class phenomena, then what are the factors that lead to it? The factors would be poverty, slum conditions. Now, if you re-examine the concept of crime and it is to be found even among the non-poor, or it is to be found among the white collar, then the factors contributing to the crime will change. So, by questioning the underlying assumption of the data, this clarification had a profound impact on the whole body of criminological theories. In a sense, by making the data true scope explicit, conceptual clarification can lead to fundamental re-evaluation of finding and the theories built upon them. Two key functions of conceptual analysis in sociological research is guide research behavior and establish observable indices. Merton argues that a researcher's conceptual framework directly influences what they do and how they interpret the finding. When a concept is clarified, it changes how a researcher views the data, leading them to draw a different conclusion. Here in this work, he refutes the idea that people are permanently stuck with concepts they inherit. While concepts can lag behind what is needed, leading to cognitive misbehavior, people can and do create new, more fitting concepts. The challenge is to recognize and correct this conceptual lag. A second critical function of conceptual analysis is to create observable indices for social data. This means finding measurable signs or indicator for abstract or unobservable social phenomena. So, when we read the chapter 4 of his book Social Theory and Structure, we see that theory transforms an isolated empirical finding by connecting the finding to a set of higher order abstraction. Finding becomes logical consequence of the theory rather than a standalone fact. A well-developed theory allows for more secure prediction than simple extrapolation from trend. A strong theory can generate diverse hypotheses in the field seemingly unrelated to the original topic. So, with this whole understanding of to differentiate between methodology and theory, concepts and theory, we need to kind of understand the significance of theories, concepts and methodology in doing sociological research. With this, I come to an end of this lecture. Thank you.